I think we're going to move on to our next speaker, who is Martin Hebart. After his PhD in psychology at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience in Berlin, he had postdoctoral positions at the University Medical Center Eppendorf in Hamburg and the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda. In 2020, Martin started the Vision and Computational Cognition Group at the Max Planck Institute for Human, Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig. Since 2022, he's additionally a Löwe Stadt Professor for the Computational Cognitive Neuroscience at Justus Liebig University in Gießen. His research revolves around the processing of visually predictive stimuli in the human mind and brain. How visual information is transformed into semantic knowledge and the human ability to interact with the visual world. To address these research questions, Martin's lab makes use of diverse methods, including the acquisition and analysis of large-scale behavioral and neuroimaging datasets, computational modeling, and advanced machine learning methods to address fundamental questions in visual and cognitive neuroscience. His talk today will have the title The Things Initiative, Improving the Generalizability of Research Findings in Vision and Semantics across Studies, Methods, and Domains.
Great. Yes, thank you. And thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this symposium. And I would also specifically like to thank the organizers for putting this together. So this has been really interesting so far. So I will talk about something that's really close to my heart, which is this Things initiative that we started a few years ago. And the focus of my research is very much in the way that we are able to see the stimuli around us and make sense of them. And I think you can appreciate how easy and how quickly you can not just like see different shapes and see different colors, but you actually are able to like quickly tell what the different stimuli are, what you would be associating with them, what are the different things you can do with them. And the big question that like our research group really is interested in is, so how do we make sense of the things in our visual world? It's not only about recognition, but how do we actually extract like meaning from the world around us? Okay, so one big challenge with understanding vision and understanding the way that we can relate this to our semantic knowledge, like the knowledge that we gathered about the world around us, is just the big diversity of different ways in which the world around us can look. So if you were to like be able to project like the entirety of all visual stimuli you may ever encounter in a human life or across many human lives, and you were to be able to project this into like a two-dimensional space, maybe something that looks like a little bit like this, right? So that where you might say like similar stimuli close to each other and dissimilar really far away from each other. Now, what we typically do when we run like experimental studies is that we handpick like a small number of these like thousands of different perceptual like impressions we can possibly gather, and we just like a bit like astronomers like pointing a telescope in the sky, and we're only like every single time just examining a smaller part of that of this kind of big possibility, this rich representational space. And every time you're running a new study, you might be like using different types of stimuli and you're looking at a different part of the sky, right? But ultimately, I guess what we want to do is we want to be able to connect the dots, right? And we want to be able to actually not measure only the individual parts here, really, but at different parts of this bigger representational space. But the big challenge really is that connecting the dots is not really trivial, because there's a lot of variability between different participants. You can't just like combine two different studies together and then just say like, okay, now we just like stack up more and more and more like experiments until we have like a general understanding of the representations, because like people are different and people have like different types of representations. There's not like a simple one-to-one mapping between people. But also the methods that people use are like really diverse. People don't only use MRI, they use like EEG, MEG, and then monkeys, they use like intracranial recordings, meant to do that in humans as well. But there's just very different scales in which you look at things. And then also people just use different types of stimuli. So one of the challenges really is like, well, to what degree do the insights that we gain in one particular study really like generalize to other studies, okay? So if you were to take this like real world object space, this hypothetical space, and you were to plot like the number of the different object categories, images that you sample in a study, then you would have like the classical experimental studies on the one end, And then people more recently started like going a bit more diverse. So they started like sampling more broadly from this representational space. And you would be like covering more, but like the way in which you select the stimuli will obviously also tell you a little bit about what will come out, right? Like if you say, oh, I guess like half of my stimuli will be man-made and half of them will be natural, well, you might not be surprised to end up finding a distinction between man-made and natural stimuli, right? And you might also end up like going to the extreme here, and you might be sampling from these big like databases like ImageNet that have like 1.5 million images, or something even like MS-COCO, which is also like more than 300,000 different stimuli. But one of the big issues really is that you may still like have some selective sampling that's just like based on how these stimuli were selected for these image sets. And you may be missing out on really like important part of this representational space. And probably more problematic, really, is the fact that, like, well, these databases were not developed with a lot of like systematicity in mind in order for us to be able to sample this space like really, really broadly. But like, if you take ImageNet as an example, there's just like a lot of dogs in there. There's like many of the classes here are really like related to dogs. So if you want to learn something about dogs, that might be a really good data set to use, but you might not necessarily be interested in that so much. And if you take MS-COCO, which is a very popular database, also neuroimaging, well, there are just like a lot of pictures of giraffes or surfers. So it just turns out they only sample from like 91 different categories. In some cases, it's actually only 80 different categories. So the diversity might be really, really limited. You might be oversampling specific parts of the space. So one thing that I think what we might be after is a sampling that may perhaps, and this, I'm just saying may, look a little bit more like this. And one way of achieving this kind of sampling may be that we may want to introduce another dimension here, rather than just going for the number of images, which is something that I think a lot of people are really interested in going like big, we need big data. I think we may also want to add a little bit of control here. So we want to be able to do some more like systematic sampling. And this is kind of the basis for what we call like the things, object concept, and object image database. So this is a database that we developed where we did a representative sampling of all the nameable objects in the American English language. And with nameable, I just mean like if I point at an object and ask you, what is this object? And that's what you name it, then we will include that object, and we show you an object and use a different name for it. We're only going to use the different name. We're not going to use something that people would not use in their everyday language, okay? Then we went about and like manually created from these 1,854 objects, 26,000 high quality images. So every individual image really is like, has a high resolution, is really checked that there's like no watermark or no like text or anything on top of it. It's really like high quality images. I think there's one image in there with a watermark actually, but like, yeah, we missed that one. And it's really, in that sense, like optimized for research, both in like psychology and neuroscience, but also like for us, which is like for us really interesting also in like in vision science. And vision scientists are really strict, right? Like when you have these types of stimuli, they'd be like nagging. And well, I think even for vision scientists, this might be good enough. Okay, so what can you actually do with such an image set? Well, one obvious thing you can do is you can go about and you collect a bunch of data, right? And that's I'm going to show you some things that you can do with it. But more interestingly, I mean, you can collect data from like MRI or MEG or EEG, and you can get behavioral data. And if you have the possibility, you can get like intracranial recordings, right? But in principle, you can also just use these stimuli and you look in like monkey, you do monkey MRI, monkey recordings of behavior, or even like from rodents. And in principle, you can also apply these data to AI models, right? But what makes this, I think, really like exciting, the fact that we have such like well-curated image data set, is that you can start and connect the dots, right? So you can, instead of just looking at the representations in one domain, let's say like one measurement method like fMRI, you can now start and use the similarity that you have through the different stimuli that are just sampled in both domains or in both methods, and just bring these methods together, right? So you can directly map them to each other without even having to go like taking a detour like through something like representational similarity analysis. You can directly map them onto each other. And you can also relate them directly like between, let's say, animal models and humans. You can see what are the similarities and differences between them. So when we started this, and this was when I was still like doing a postdoc in the Baker lab, and then later when I started my own lab in Leipzig, we told other people about this, and other people really got excited about the idea. And today there's many different labs. I'm not even able to show all of them here. There's about like 15 different labs really participating in what we now call the Things Initiative, which is just like people collecting data just for the sake of like having the data available, and then with the aim of actually even like making it publicly available. So for example, there's like the Neuromod initiative has collected another fMRI data set. There is IT and monkey IT recordings or EEG recordings, also EEG recordings in humans. And there's like a recent paper that just should be coming out like in like this or next week from Paolo Papale doing like monkey recordings concurrently in V1, V4, and IT. And I think you can appreciate like all the possibilities that can arise from having like such data available in principle. So I just want to show you some examples of the things that we've done or we can do in the future with this type of data. So one thing that Laura, who's a grad student in our lab, and that was doing this as an undergrad, was what she did is like just collect more normed data, right? So for a lot of like semantic research and a lot of like language related research as well, people really care about these types of norms. So what we ended up doing is just collect like lots of like metadata, including like category or typicality norms, recognizability for the individual images, perceived curvature, and lots of different feature ratings. What you can see here is the reproducibility of the data. So this is like the split half reliability, sorry, not reproducibility, reliability of the data. This is the external validity where we just compare to existing data. And the thing where you can see here really nicely is that the reliability of most of the data, apart from arousal, I'd say, is really, really high. And it also like generalizes actually quite well to other data. So in other words, I think this is a really high quality data set, and in principle can also be used for a lot of like different research questions. And if you are interested in some variable that we haven't measured, well, chances are we are really interested in getting this variable. So someone recently asked us, can you do aesthetics ratings? Yes, we did, because they're really easy to collect. So we just collected them, and now people can run experiments with aesthetics as well. One other thing that people really cared about is like semantic features, right? So this is something that would be like a little bit too much to collect, because there's thousands of different ways you can come up with different semantic features, like what are the properties of a dog? Well, it's something that is alive, it's something that has 4 legs, etc., has fur, etc. And so, so doing something like this seemed a bit too excessive for us. So Hannes Hansen, who was also like an undergrad in the lab, he went about, and this was like before the ages of ChatGPT, he went and used GPT-3 in order to just probe it and ask, well, what are the different properties? And at that time, it was still like a little harder to do. But we ended up actually verifying this with human data. So what you see here on the left is like the human generated, some of the human generated labels for label of dog. There's actually no image involved. This is just for visualization purposes. And here are the GPT inferred labels. And if you run like some similarity analysis between the two, looking at these examples, I think you can appreciate there's like actually a really decent similarity between these human generated and AI generated labels. So in other words, the data that we have here, I think that what it's showing is that you can, in principle, actually, when you ask them the right kinds of questions, you can really extract some really interesting information from these AI models that you can actually use for generating these types of norms for like thousands of different stimuli. So another recent development that we published a few years ago was that we were interested in understanding what dimensions people use when they make judgments about the similarity of objects. So for example, if I was going to ask you to judge which of these 3 objects is the odd one out, you may say, well, it's the dog because the dog is alive and the other 2 objects are not. Or you may say that the apple is the odd one out because, I don't know, the apple's round, or the apple is something you can eat. And you might say that the car is the odd one out because the car, I don't know, the car is something that is man-made, and the other 2 objects are natural, right? So all of these may be like possible dimensions underlying our judgments of the similarity of objects. So what we did is like we collected odd one out judgments for all of these 1,854 objects. We then developed a computational model of the task that allows us to infer the dimensions underlying the similarity judgments about these objects. And we collected a large-scale online data set of 1.46 million responses in humans using like Amazon Mechanical Turk. So what we ended up finding was an embedding that we learned from the data that had 49 behaviorally relevant dimensions. And well, to what degree can you actually use these dimensions to predict behavior? So we looked at the behavioral responses here, which is like the prediction accuracy in single trial behavior, that is. And we looked at the best possible performance any model can achieve, which is given by the ceiling here. And here's the performance of our model. And it just turns out that it's actually doing a really good job. It's capturing about 92% of the explainable variance in single trial behavior, that is. And the big question really is, well, are the dimensions that we get back here from this embedding, are they also interpretable? Do they make sense? Like, can we actually really identify like meaningful dimensions underlying these similarity judgments? And indeed, this is what we find. So there are like the dimensions that are like related to more like categorical things, like something that's animal related, or like something that's more related to like fire related, like properties of objects. But then you can also think of more like visual features, like something being round or something being colorful, or also how valuable an object is, or like how patterned like the individual things on the object are. So together, this really highlights like both like visual perceptual, but also like high level semantic dimensions underlying these similarity judgments. And we can identify what are the properties that people end up using. So what this means is we can also like turn the whole process around, and we can then go about and characterize individual images as a combination of these different features. So this is actually a lot of fun to do. So this was just like a quick way of like highlighting some of the things you can do with this. We ended up like collecting even more behavioral data from like 12,000 participants that we made publicly available. And then in collaboration with like the Baker Lab with Lina Teichmann, but also Oliver Conti, another grad student in my lab, we analyzed some of the data that I ended up collecting when I was still like at NIH, together with like other people at NIH. And we ended up collecting like 3 participants in fMRI, where we showed to each participant roughly like 9,000 different unique images. In the MEG, we collected more like 22,000 different images. And well, one way of doing this is, of course, you have to do this across different days. And in order to make the data comparable across different days, so this was in total like 12 to 14 sessions, we're using these individualized head cases that brings people back in the exact same position across different sessions. And I think the data are really like actually really nice quality. Of course, there's like bigger data sets out now, like with 7 Tesla, but yeah, I think this is actually a really useful data set for asking like questions that are really like looking at this diversity of our visual experiences. So one other thing you can do with this is you can like go back and you look at other studies that have been conducted in the past, and you can see like to what degree they would actually end up generalizing. And one thing that we did is we looked at this animacy and size organization. So one idea is that like if you look at the typical regions that you find in higher level visual cortex related to processing of faces or body parts or scenes, so like FFA, FBA, or PPA, and you also look at this organization and the lateral side of the brain, you may think that, well, is there maybe like a bigger like core scale organization underlying this? And something that was proposed by Talia Konkel and Alfonso Karamazza about like 10 years ago was that maybe it's like a size it's an animacy and size organization, so that like you have like big objects and represented like towards the periphery, and animals would be like be processed more like in the center, and you have small objects also being separate, and you have this like tripartite organization. So what Laura Stowinski in our lab is doing, also in collaboration with Talia, is now looking into what degree these results generalize. And what she did is like she ran this vector of regions of interest analysis. So we're now plotting across like the surface of individual brains. And what you can see is like for a large number of different features that we looked into, what is the incremental variance? So what's like the unique explanatory value, the added explanatory value of individual variables here? And instead of like really finding this like strong preference of animacy is what we would have expected to find, by looking at more variables, because we can do this even if they're highly collinear, because we have just much more data available, we can see that like animacy is actually not the best explaining variable across all of these different regions. Just turns out actually that the fact that something moves, or the fact that something has agency, may be actually explaining a little bit more. And the same goes for the real world size organization, but there really like size seems to be doing a fairly good job, but there's other variables that may also be explaining the organization here. One other thing that you can do is now you can bring these data sets together, right? Like you can actually start now connecting the different dots. So here's like a study that was done by Oliver Contier that was just recently published. So we looked at these like 3 densely sampled participants and we tried to relate them to these behavioral similarity judgments that we had collected. And if you do this in the traditional way of using this like representational similarity analysis, where you look at like where does the similarity of these different objects related to the similarity in patterns of brain activity, what you find is, well, here's like the back of the brain and you move a little bit like to the front. So here's the ventral visual cortex. You find that more like higher level visual regions really seem to be primarily involved, right? And that kind of makes sense because you think that, well, that's where the behavioral readout is really happening. Now, what happens if you look at this with these like 49 behaviorally relevant dimensions? Well, the picture looks actually slightly different. What we now find is much more widely distributed information. So even the earliest like processing stages like V1, V2, V3 are carrying information about these like behaviorally relevant dimensions. So this is something that would have like just been smeared out by just integrating across these different dimensions. By like looking at them individually, we're able to actually highlight that there's not like only these early responses, and not only this high-level visual responses, but also like the early responses carrying like this behaviorally relevant information. One other thing you can do is you can look at MEG and behavior, and you can just look at how these responses then evolve for these different dimensions across time. And this is work from Lina Teichmann again. And what you can see nicely is like the different dimensions are playing a different role across time. There's really like this nice like dance of these different dimensions really happening. And for me, it's really a lot of fun always to look at these types of plots because they're so rich and it's really like telling us a lot of really interesting things. But of course, you can also relate like fMRI data together with MEG. So there's no, like you can really run like a direct fusion of methods. There's no representational similarity analysis needed. So one thing you can find, for example, is that if you look in area V1, you may find like an early peak in the response to different objects. And if you then look at FFA at the MEG response, you may find like a later peak here. Now, one other example I want to briefly share is like another like behavior study that we ran. This was with Max Kramer from the Bainbridge lab. And what we ended up doing is we looked at the representation of memorability. So memorability is a stimulus property. It means that some images, for some reason, just turn out to be easier to remember than other stimuli. So if I was going to ask like one person, like if this is like a stimulus they would remember, so I would be running like such an experiment with them, and I do the same experiment on another person. It just turns out that like both of them would probably remember this image here of a candy bar. This actually looks really appetizing to me. But there's also like, if you were to look at like this example of a windshield, then people would probably like totally forget this because it's like, this is by far the most forgettable image that we have. So one question that we asked really here was like, well, to what degree are these effects really like driven by the image itself or by more like semantic effects? And what we find is that we can actually predict memorability to a certain degree using these like semantic dimensions that we've identified. And the visual variance is actually not like that big. It's actually only explaining a much smaller portion of the memorability response. So in other words, like a lot of the memorability is really like driven by large scale semantics. Okay, so this was like a quick tour de force. I mean, I really just wanted to highlight like lots of different possibilities of like using these data and what can be done with this. If you are interested in collecting data with them, you wouldn't even have to like share them publicly, right? But just think about the possibilities. If you run experiments using these stimuli, you can literally have access to all of these different resources. If you have 100 images collected in humans, you can directly now go and download the data from the monkeys, and you can see like, okay, how are my stimuli going to be relating to monkey data, or you can relate them to other kinds of metadata that might be interesting. So there's many different kinds of experiments you can think of. So let me just quickly summarize. I think it's really important not only to consider like broad sampling of different stimuli, but also like a systematic sampling that would allow you to really like cover the broad like semantic space that we're really interested in understanding, right? Like it's not only about like visual diversity, but it should also be about like semantic diversity. And that will then allow us to yield like generalizable insights for understanding these representations. And this, I think, can be really used to evaluate many of the previous research findings, which I was trying to show with one example, and test their reproducibility and also generalizability. And we think that like things can act as a sort of like Rosetta Stone that allows you like translating between the different kind of research studies, methods, and domains. So with that, I'm just going to skip over the last like bonus part. And with that, I'd just like to thank everyone in my lab and everyone who was also like participating and like my collaborators, like the Baker Lab and Machine Learning Core, and all of my funding agencies. And I'm very happy to take questions.